Picture yourself on a road in Germany. The year is 1921. You have been walking for 4 days. Your boots are worn through. You have not eaten since yesterday morning. The war ended 3 years ago, but you are still trying to find where your life went, because the life you had before 1914 no longer exists. The factory closed. The money you saved is worth less than the paper it is printed on. You are one of hundreds of thousands of men moving across this country on foot, sleeping in fields, working for food, invisible to everyone, registered nowhere, missed by no one. Then a man opens a door. He is calm, ordinary looking, a little heavy, gray at the temples. He tells you his name is Karl. He says you can sleep inside tonight. He has food on the stove. He asks for nothing in return. You step inside. You are never seen again. This happened at least 30 times, in the same apartment, on the same street, in a quiet German town where everyone knew everyone, and everyone trusted Karl. On December 21st, 1924, a man named Vincent Oliver stumbled out of that apartment with an axe wound to his skull and collapsed in the street screaming for help. When police entered Carl Denke's home, they found 2 large wooden barrels filled with pickled human flesh soaking in brine, 311 human teeth stored in a wooden box in the dresser drawer, 480 bone fragments in the shed out back, jars of rendered human fat lined up on kitchen shelves, and on the table a handwritten ledger, 31 names, dates, body weights, maintained without interruption for over 20 years. Carl Denka was 54 years old. His neighbors called him Vater, Father. Some of them had eaten the meat he sold at the market and thanked him for it. Forensic evidence would later suggest he had been killing people inside that house as far back as 1903, and possibly earlier. To understand how Carl Denka operated undetected for over 2 decades, you need to understand what Germany looked like in the years surrounding his peak activity. Because the social and economic catastrophe of Weimar Germany is not background detail in this story. It is structural. It is the reason the killing was possible at the scale it reached. Germany entered the post-war period with over 6 million wounded veterans, a shattered industrial base, and a reparations bill from the Treaty of Versailles that the new Weimar government had no realistic means of paying. Political violence was endemic from the start. Between 1919 and 1923, there were hundreds of political assassinations across Germany, multiple attempted coups, and near-constant street fighting between armed factions in the major cities. The country was not recovering. It was barely holding together. Then came the hyperinflation. By 1921, price increases were severe. By 1922, they were catastrophic. By late 1923, Germany had experienced something that most people in the modern world have never encountered and struggle to conceptualize. The German mark lost 99.9% of its value within a single year. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily so they could spend their wages before the next price surge made them worthless. Wheelbarrows of banknotes were required to buy a single loaf of bread. Some families burned currency as heating fuel because it was cheaper than buying firewood. Middle-class families who had saved carefully for decades found their entire life savings worth less than a postage stamp. Small business owners, pensioners, tradespeople, craftsmen, financially annihilated within months. The social contract that had held German society together for generations simply dissolved. The human result was a vast population of displaced, desperate people moving across the country. Official estimates from 1923 place the homeless population of Germany at between 800,000 and 1 million people living on the roads, in temporary shelters, or in charitable institutions. The actual number was almost certainly higher. Many people were too ashamed to register with any official body. Former soldiers who had survived 4 years of industrial slaughter on the Western Front found themselves sleeping in fields 2 years after the armistice, unable to find work, unable to feed their families, unable to find a fixed place in a country that had no place to offer them. These were Karl Denke's victims, not because they were weak, but because the world had already made them invisible. And Denke understood that invisibility with a precision that took years to develop and decades to exploit. To understand how this specific town became the location of one of the most sustained series of killings in European criminal history, the geography matters. Silesia was a region that had been traded between empires for centuries, part German, part Polish, part Czech in its cultural DNA. It was a region of farmers, small craftsmen, and industrial workers, not prosperous, not cosmopolitan. The kind of place where families had lived on the same streets for generations and where a man's reputation was built slowly, defended fiercely, and almost never questioned once established. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 had redrawn Silesia's borders along new national lines, creating significant economic disruption and a constant movement of workers across the region looking for employment that was increasingly scarce. This regional instability fed directly into the pattern of transient labor that Denke relied upon. Workers moved between towns on foot, following rumors of jobs, sleeping where they could. Nobody in Münsterberg would have found it unusual that a stranger occasionally appeared at a local resident's door asking for work or shelter. It was simply what was happening across the region, and had been for years. Münsterberg itself was a small town of a few thousand people. Cobblestone streets, church bells on Sunday. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone had known everyone for decades. In this environment, Carl Denka, who had lived on Stawowa Street for over 20 years, by the time of his arrest, was not just familiar. He was fixed. He was furniture. He was part of the neighborhood's identity in the way that old buildings and old trees become part of a place's identity, present for so long that their presence is simply assumed, and their absence would be the thing that required explanation. This was his greatest protection, not cleverness alone, not luck. 2 decades of accumulated, unquestioned presence in a community too small and too stable to imagine that the man at the end of the street was anything other than what he appeared to be. Karl Denke was born on August 12, 1870, in Münsterberg. His family owned agricultural land and was considered modest but respectable by local standards, the kind of family that did not attract attention, positive or negative. His father was a farmer. His mother's history is largely undocumented. Denke was the youngest child. By every surviving account, he was deeply withdrawn from early childhood, a poor student who struggled academically and was described by at least one contemporary as almost unreachable. He did not form friendships easily. He sat at the edge of groups rather than within them. He was the kind of child adults described as quiet, meaning they had little sense of what was happening inside him and had stopped trying to find out. None of this was unusual enough to warrant concern in a small German town in the 1880s. What was unusual, and what has never been adequately explained, is what happened when he was 12 years old. Denke left home without explanation and disappeared for several years. No record places him anywhere during this period. No employer, no church registry, no police file, no family correspondence. He was simply gone, and the record of where he went during those years went with him. When he returned to Münsterberg as a young adult, his father had died and left him an inheritance. Denke used the money to purchase a small plot of farmland on the outskirts of town. The farm failed completely within a few years. He sold it, moved into the ground-floor apartment at Stawowa Street, and set up a small workshop selling leather goods, belts, shoelaces, and suspenders, alongside what he described to customers as pork fat and boneless meat. He transported these products regularly to the market in Breslau, the regional capital roughly 40 miles away. His prices were competitive. His customers were satisfied. He was known in the community as the local church organist, a position that placed him at the center of neighborhood life every Sunday morning. He developed a reputation for generosity toward the homeless men who occasionally knocked on his door. His neighbors appreciated him. His customers trusted him. At some point in the early 1900s, he quietly stopped attending church and gave up the organ. No reason was ever recorded. He simply stopped going, and nobody pressed him on it. The first name in Karl Denke's ledger is Ida Launer. The date written beside her name is 1903. That is the entirety of what is known about her. No age, no town of origin, no physical description, no surviving family record, a name and a year in a dead man's handwriting, and nothing else. The second entry is Emma Sander, 1909. Again, almost nothing survives beyond the entry itself. Between 1903 and 1914, the ledger entries are sparse. Whether this reflects the actual pace of the killings in those early years, or whether the ledger was started partway through a timeline that had already been running for some time, cannot be determined. The forensic bone evidence recovered from the property showed significant variation in decomposition levels between fragments, some material clearly older than others by years, possibly decades, which is consistent with victims spanning a very long period and does not rule out killing activity before 1903. By 1914, the entries begin appearing more regularly. Through the war years of 1914 to 1918, the ledger shows consistent, uninterrupted activity. The enormous disruption of the war did not break Denke's pattern in any detectable way. By the early 1920s, as hyperinflation drives more desperate men onto the roads, the pace accelerates noticeably. Multiple entries appear within weeks of each other. The years 1921 to 1924 represent the highest density period in the record. The last entry is dated November 17, 1924. Name: Rochus Paulik, fur trader from Breslau. Body weight recorded in the same neat handwriting as every entry before it. Killed 34 days before the arrest. The ledger does not end dramatically. It simply stops. The next page is blank. Most of Karl Denke's victims will never be fully identified. They came from the margins of a collapsing society, and the margins left no records. But from the entries that investigators were able to cross-reference with regional documents, a partial picture emerges. And it matters, because these were real people. Heinrich Bruchmann, carpenter, killed February 2nd, 1914. One of the few victims whose occupation and name could both be confirmed through external records. a tradesman who built things with his hands and moved between towns following construction work. Nebel, railroad worker, killed January 8, 1919. The armistice had been signed less than 2 months earlier. He had presumably survived 4 years of industrial slaughter on the Western or Eastern Front, made it home from the war, and then knocked on the wrong door in Münsterberg in the first winter of peace. 2 bakers, a painter, a locksmith, a blacksmith, men with specific trades, specific skills, men who under different circumstances would have had stable working lives and left behind records and families and colleagues who knew their names. The youngest recorded victim was 16 years old. The oldest was 76. One victim, a man named Adam Polzin, had reportedly told someone in a nearby town that he was heading to Münsterberg to look for work with a man named Denke who had offered him a job. That information did not reach investigators until after the arrest. By then, Polzin had been dead for over a year. More than 20 of the 31 entries could not be matched to any known individual in any surviving official record. No missing persons report, no church registry, no labor document, no family correspondence anywhere in Silesia. They existed in Denke's ledger and nowhere else in the world. This was not coincidence. It was selection. Denke had spent years developing a precise instinct for identifying people with no social safety net, no family waiting, no employer tracking movements, no fixed address that would create a paper trail of absence. He was not choosing randomly from whoever knocked on his door. He was choosing carefully, and he had been doing it for a very long time. The physical evidence recovered from Stawowa Street allowed forensic investigators to reconstruct Denke's operational method with considerable accuracy. What that reconstruction reveals is a process refined through repetition into something approaching systematic precision. The killing itself was fast, a single blow to the head, most likely the axe found in the apartment. Death was rapid in most cases. The distribution of blood evidence indicated victims were struck close to the entrance, almost immediately upon entering, before they had time to move deeper into the space or react to any change in Denke's demeanor. They came in expecting food or work. The door closed. Within seconds, it was over. What followed was methodical. The butchering technique, reconstructed from cut patterns on the recovered bone fragments, was practiced and precise. Clean cuts at the correct anatomical separation points, consistent with someone who had performed this process many times and knew exactly how to proceed. This was not improvisation. The fat rendering required sustained heat over several hours, a process with a strong, distinctive smell conducted in a ground-floor apartment with neighbors on either side and passers-by on the street outside. How 20 years of this activity produced no recorded complaint about unusual smells from Denke's apartment remains one of the genuinely unexplained aspects of the case. If neighbors noticed and said nothing, no record of it survives. The 311 teeth were extracted from each victim and stored in the wooden box in the dresser. Why Denke kept them has never been satisfactorily explained. They had no practical value. They were not displayed. They were stored and organized. Some analysts have suggested they functioned as a physical parallel to the written ledger, a tactile record alongside the documentary one. The honest answer is that nobody knows. The bones were cleaned and moved to the shed, physically separated from the living space, reducing discovery risk during any casual visit. The skin was processed into leather. The suspenders found on Denka's body at arrest were made from it. The meat went into barrels of brine. Some of it went to the market in Breslau. All of this happened repeatedly over 20 years in a residential building in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and nobody knew. Of all the dimensions of this case, the question of the Breslau market is the one investigators found most difficult to address, not because the answer was complicated, but because the full implications of an honest answer were almost impossible to communicate publicly without causing widespread panic. Breslau, today the Polish city of Wrocław, was the regional capital of Silesia, roughly 40 miles from Münsterberg. A large, busy city with a substantial public market where vendors from across the region came regularly to sell food, leather goods, and household products. Carl Denka had been a fixture at that market for years. 2 product lines, leather goods, and what he described as pork fat and boneless meat. Regular customers, trusted prices, a familiar face at the stall. The forensic investigation confirmed without ambiguity that the fat was human in origin. The pickled meat was human. The leather goods, human skin. What could not be determined was how much product had already left the apartment before the arrest. How many trips over, how many years. How many customers had purchased what they believed to be pork fat or boneless meat and taken it home to their families. The investigation acknowledged this problem, documented it, and moved past it, because there was no forensic methodology available in 1924 to trace consumed organic material back to a vendor after the fact. The customers who had purchased from Denka's stall were never identified, never contacted, and never informed. That question was left permanently open, and it has remained open ever since. It is against this backdrop, the market, the customers, the open question, that the case of Carl Denka needs to be placed alongside 2 other men operating in Germany at exactly the same time. Georg Grossmann operated in Berlin. He killed an unknown number of women in his apartment. Estimates from the investigation range from 20 to 50 victims. He processed their remains and sold human flesh at the local market in exactly the same manner as Denka, hundreds of miles away in Silesia. He hanged himself in prison before sentencing. He never explained himself either. Fritz Harman operated in Hanover between 1918 and 1924. At least 24 confirmed victims, young men and boys, most of them homeless or runaway, most of them completely unknown to anyone who would report their absence. Arrested June 1924, tried publicly in one of the most extensively covered criminal proceedings in Weimar, Germany, convicted, executed by guillotine in April 1925. What made the Harman case particularly damaging to public trust was a detail that emerged during the trial. He had been a registered police informant. Investigators had received complaints about him and cleared him multiple times before his arrest. The men who should have caught him had been using him as a source. Carl Denka, arrested December 1924, 3 serial killers, 3 German cities, 1 year. Historians have been careful not to overstate the direct connection. These men did not know each other, their crimes were not coordinated, but 3 perpetrators with near-identical operational patterns, all active simultaneously in the same country, all targeting the socially invisible, all processing victims in domestic settings, all selling human material at public markets. This is not coincidence of character. It is a reflection of a specific social landscape. A country with a massive unregistered population of displaced people moving through its cities and towns. No systematic missing persons tracking, no forensic databases, no centralized criminal intelligence, no investigative infrastructure that would eventually make this kind of sustained domestic-scale killing significantly harder to maintain. Weimar Germany did not create these men, but it created the conditions in which they could operate, and it created the supply of victims who made the scale of their crimes possible. Vincent Oliver was not a wealthy man. He was not an important man by any social measure of the time. He was another wanderer on the road in Weimar Germany, looking for work, looking for shelter, looking for something that might resemble stability in a country that had very little of it to offer. Exactly the kind of person Carl Denka had been selecting for over 2 decades. What brought Oliver specifically to Denka's door on the morning of December 21st, 1924, is not documented in any surviving record. Whether he had been told about Denka by someone else, whether he had some prior connection, or whether it was simply the closest open door on a cold winter morning. None of this is known. What is known is that he arrived. He stepped inside, and at some point inside the apartment, Denka struck him in the head with an axe. The blow was hard enough to split the scalp and cause a serious wound, but it did not penetrate the skull. Oliver did not lose consciousness immediately. Through adrenaline, physical resistance, or some combination of both, he managed to pull away from Denka, get to the door, get it open, and reach the street. Passers-by found him outside the building, bleeding heavily, barely able to stand, pointing back at the building behind him, screaming. A crowd gathered. Someone went for the police. When officers arrived at Stowowa Street, Carl Denka was inside the apartment. He was calm. He told them that Oliver had attacked him first and that he had acted in self-defense. He delivered this explanation without apparent anxiety, without stumbling over his words, without any visible sign of stress. He had been presenting a false identity to the world for 20 years. One more conversation with a local policeman was not something that rattled him. Several accounts from the period note that the responding officer's initial reaction was genuine hesitation, not procedural hesitation, but personal hesitation. These were men who knew Carl Denka, who had nodded to him on the street for years. The idea that he was capable of attacking anyone was, to people who knew him, simply difficult to process. They had no framework for it. They searched the apartment anyway. The barrels were in the kitchen. The jars were on the shelves. The box was in the dresser drawer. The bones were in the shed. The ledger was on the table. Within hours, the property was under full search, and samples were being packaged for the forensic laboratory in Breslau. Carl Denka was taken to the police station and placed in a holding cell. He said nothing. He asked for nothing. He sat down in the cell and waited. The neighbors stood in the street outside and tried to understand what they were being told. Most of them couldn't. The forensic laboratory in Breslau received samples from Stowowa Street on December 22, 1924. Given the nature of what the initial search had uncovered, the analysis was treated as urgent. The results were unambiguous on every count. The pickled meat from the barrels, human flesh. The rendered fat in the jars, human in origin. The bone fragments showed cut marks fully consistent with deliberate, practiced butchering using sharp instruments. The cut patterns indicating repeated confident application rather than the irregular marks of an inexperienced hand. The 311 teeth in the wooden box had come from multiple different individuals. Professor Euler's dental analysis established a confirmed minimum of 20 distinct individuals from the sample alone, with statistical modeling of the distribution patterns suggesting the actual number was meaningfully higher. The leather goods found at the property, including the suspenders that Carl Denka had been wearing on his body at the time of his arrest, the same suspenders the arresting officers had seen on him and had not removed, were subjected to material analysis. The results indicated processed human skin. The suspenders Carl Denka had put on that morning, the ones he wore when police led him out of his apartment and down to the station, had been made from the skin of one of his victims. The pond behind the property, a small body of water that Denka had dug himself years earlier, yielded a fragment of a human leg. The surrounding woodland yielded additional skeletal fragments. The complete bone inventory across the entire property totaled 480 individual fragments. The total physical evidence pointed to a confirmed minimum of 30 victims. The assessment of skeletal material, taking into account significant variation in decomposition levels between fragments, indicating remains from victims killed across a very long time span, suggested a real total of between 40 and 42 individuals. The ledger recorded 31. The gap between 31 and 42 represents people whose names were never written down, people who came to Stawoa Street and left no entry behind them at all. Carl Denka spent the night of December 21, 1924, in a holding cell at the Münsterberg police station. Standard cell, small room, window bar mounted near the ceiling, checked by the duty officer at standard intervals through the night. On the morning of December 22nd, he was found dead. He had used his suspenders, the human skin suspenders he had been wearing at the time of his arrest, which had not been removed from him during booking, to fashion a ligature attached to the window bar of the cell. He hanged himself at some point during the night. He had been in custody for less than 24 hours. No formal interrogation had taken place. The investigating team had spent the previous day processing physical evidence and preparing for what they expected to be an extensive series of interviews beginning that morning. They had questions, they had evidence, they had a defendant, then they had a body. Not a single question had been asked and answered on the record. The motive for 20 years of killing, the psychology behind the ledger, the missing years of his childhood, the reason he kept the teeth, the full timeline, the true number of victims, why he chose this, when it started, whether he ever considered stopping. All of it died in that cell on the morning of December 22nd, 1924. He left no note, no confession, no final statement of any kind. The most complete account of his crimes that existed anywhere in the world was the document he had left on his own table, written not as an explanation, but as an inventory. Everything else he took with him, and it has never been recovered. Carl Denka was not poor. He had a home, a business, a stable income, and a respected position in his community. Financial desperation does not explain what he did. He showed no outward signs of psychological breakdown across 2 decades of killing. He was organized, consistent, and socially functional. He maintained long-term relationships with neighbors and business contacts without triggering a single documented expression of concern from anyone who knew him. No sexual motive was established by the forensic investigation, no ideological motive, no motive of hatred toward any identifiable group. The killings appear to have been functional rather than driven by any of the motivational frameworks that typically structure the analysis of this kind of case, which is precisely what makes Denke so difficult to categorize. What the evidence establishes with complete clarity is sustained, rational calculation in victim selection, consistently targeting people with no social ties, refined and maintained over more than 20 years without a single error until Vincent Oliver survived a blow that should have killed him. That level of sustained rational awareness, running in parallel with a completely functional public identity, is what forensic analysts return to most consistently when they study this case. The nearest clinical frameworks applied retrospectively involve severe, stable personality pathology, the kind of deeply ingrained disorder in which behaviors that would cause profound distress in most people are experienced by the individual as simply consistent with how they understand themselves, not a break from reality, a different reality maintained in parallel with the one visible to everyone else, without apparent conflict between the two. But these are frameworks applied from outside, decades later, without any direct psychological data from the subject. The honest position, the only position the evidence actually supports, is that we do not know why Carl Denka did what he did. We know what he did, approximately when, approximately to whom. The why died in a holding cell on December 22, 1924, and was never recovered. German law in 1924 provided no mechanism for prosecuting a dead man. There would be no trial, no public testimony, no judicial reckoning. The investigation continued for several months, not to build a prosecution, but to establish the factual record as completely as possible before the file was formally closed. Professor Euler led the forensic work in Breslau. His team spent weeks on the dental analysis alone, identifying distinct wear patterns, decay configurations, and root structures to establish the minimum victim count. The bone analysis showed decomposition variation across a long time span, consistent with the earliest ledger entries from 1903 and suggesting the killing may have begun before the first recorded entry. Investigators cross-referenced all 31 names against every available regional record source, municipal registries across Silesia, parish records, military demobilization lists from 1918 and 1919, labor guild registries, charitable institution intake records. Fewer than 10 names could be matched with reasonable confidence to a known individual in any external document. More than 20 of the confirmed victims existed in no surviving official record other than Denke's own handwriting. The investigation was formally concluded in early 1925. The file was closed. No verdict was ever rendered. No sentence was ever handed down. The case of Carl Denke ended not with justice, not with explanation, but with a stamp on a file folder and a case number that disappeared into a regional archive. If Carl Denke is less known today than the scale of his crimes warrants, the explanation is not simply the passage of time. It is the systematic, near-total destruction of the documentary record. In January 1945, Soviet forces advanced into Silesia as part of the final drive toward Berlin. The German civilian population of Münsterberg fled westward. The municipal archive was not evacuated. It burned, along with the majority of the town's historical documentation. After the war, the Potsdam Agreement transferred Silesia to Poland. The remaining German population was expelled. Approximately 12 million people moved westward, stripped of property, community, and the physical spaces that had defined their lives. Münsterberg became Siembice. Streets were renamed. Buildings were demolished or repurposed. The cultural memory of the German town was systematically dismantled. Stawowa Street was renamed. The building where Denke lived and killed no longer stands. The pond behind the property was filled in. The church where he was known as the local organist was damaged in the fighting of 1945 and later rebuilt in modified form. There is no memorial in Siembice to the victims of Karl Denka, no historical marker, no plaque, no public acknowledgement that 30 or more people were killed in this neighborhood across a 20-year period. The original ledger, the only document that recorded most of the victims' names anywhere in the world, did not survive. Whether destroyed in the 1945 burning of the archive or lost in the post-war administrative chaos, it is gone. The names that were in it are gone with it, except for the small number recorded in press reports and forensic summaries before the archive burned. What survives today is a reconstruction built from fragments, newspaper coverage from December 1924 and January 1925, a small number of forensic summaries published in Silesian medical literature before the war, and secondary accounts assembled by historians working from those fragments in the decades since. The case was substantially rediscovered by researchers in the late 20th century through painstaking work in surviving newspaper archives in Germany and Poland. It remains significantly less documented than the Harman case, which survived the war with a more complete record intact. On December 21, 1924, Vincent Oliver walked out of an apartment in Münsterberg with an axe wound in his head and changed everything. Not through bravery, not through the working of any system, not through investigation or intelligence or any institutional response. He survived a blow that was meant to kill him, and he reached the street. That is all. That is the entire reason this story exists as a known story rather than an unsolved disappearance, or no story at all. Had Oliver died in that apartment, Denke would have cleaned up. He would have made his entries. He would have packed what he had and gone to the market in Breslau that weekend. He would have nodded to his neighbors on Stawowa Street and waited with the patience he had demonstrated for 20 years for the next knock on his door. This is not speculation. It is the logical extension of a pattern that had functioned without interruption or detection for over 2 decades. There was no investigation closing in, no informant, no accumulating evidence, no forensic thread being pulled. There was nothing until there was a bleeding man screaming in the street. The 31 names in the ledger and the unknown number of others who never made it into the record were people who came to Münsterberg looking for what everyone looks for: work, safety, warmth, a moment of ordinary human decency in a country that had very little of any of those things to offer in the years after the war. They found a man who appeared, by every visible and social measure, to be exactly that kind of ordinary human decency. They stepped inside. The door closed. Carl Denka is dead. He died before anyone could ask him a single question. The town where he killed has a different name now. The street has a different name. The building is gone. The archive burned. The ledger is lost. The pond is filled in. The church is rebuilt. The neighbors are long dead. The customers at the Breslau market never knew what they had purchased and were never told. What remains are fragments. Newspaper columns from December 1924. Forensic summaries in journals that survived by chance. and 31 names, recorded by a man who thought of their owners as inventory, and who, in one of the more terrible ironies of this case, is the only reason those names were preserved at all. They were real people. They had trades and ages and the ordinary human desire to get through another winter. They came to a door that appeared to be offering exactly what they needed. Their names were in the ledger. Now they are here.